Hello there, welcome to this video where we're going to be looking at 6 different generally cool vessels from different sci-fi franchises. So it's 6 different spaceships that I happen to find pretty cool. Now before I get started, if you like this video or any others that I'm making, please like, share and subscribe, and please comment. Let me know what you think I missed on this list, any ships you think are really cool. I'll probably do another list like this in the future, as I really found it difficult to decide which 6 starships were worthy, and I tried to limit it to one per franchise, and that was hard because there's so many ships, particularly in Star Trek, that I really love. But anyway, with that said, let's get started with this episode. And starting at number 6, we have the Yautja Mothership. Now I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is the vessel we see at the beginning of AVP. Now I thought, whatever you think of the movie, I personally quite like it. I mean, I like almost anything with Lance Henriksen in it, so it's a good film to me. But whatever your personal opinions on it, that ship was cool. This huge black behemoth of a vessel just silently coasting through space. These ships have a multitude of abilities as well. They first start have an advanced cloaking device, a bit like what we see in Star Trek, but mostly what you see similar to the Predators themselves, just a bigger, more advanced version. These things are completely undetectable. In the games and in the other expanded universe, Earth vessels can't see these things coming. They can destroy an Earth ship before it even realizes they're there. It's got plasma beam weapons that are capable of cutting through miles of ice in seconds. They've got missile systems that can destroy an Earth warship in the blink of an eye, quicker than they can react and even try and maneuver out of the way or try and shoot them down. It's unknown what kind of shielding this vessel has, but it's likely that it's got some advanced shielding, not to mention the fact that its hull is probably near impenetrable considering the kind of alloys this race seems to be able to produce. It uses holographic interface technology and does have onboard stasis chambers for long journeys. The vessels also very commonly are home to a single clan, although it's not unreasonable that multiple vessels may be owned by multiple clans, by a single clan even. A lot of these ships have a xenomorph queen kept on board to produce the facehuggers, so that the Predators' initiates can have something dangerous to hunt as a rite of passage. Generally speaking, this vessel was cool. They've got little drop pods that allow them to deploy Predators to a planet's surface or to another vessel. They've got small scout craft, and generally this ship is designed to be a base of operations for a clan or hunting party, and not directly engage in combat itself, but maybe send out its smaller support craft to do the mean nasty work itself, while it stays behind as a sort of CNC ship. But generally a very cool design, and in a maybe not so cool movie to some, but again, I like it. At number 5, I've selected the Siege Perilous class battlecruiser from Andromeda. This ship was a vessel developed late in the days of the old Commonwealth as a last-ditch attempt to use overwhelming force and technology, basically a combination of all the greatest knowledge, all the greatest firepower technology the High Guard had at its disposal, invested into a small number of these extremely powerful, huge, heavy cruisers, which it was hoped could turn the tide of war. And although they were unsuccessful, these vessels were rarely lost in combat and were often basically kick the butts of the Nietzscheans and anyone else that they came across, often surviving for hundreds of years after the fall of the Commonwealth under difficult conditions all over the place. These were 9 destructible starships, named for a position at the Round Table reserved by Merlin in Arthurian legend for the knight who would one day successfully recover the Holy Grail. These ships were somewhat perhaps seen as the vessels that would recover the Commonwealth from darkness. Although not entirely accurate, it was still a very optimistic view. These vessels were described as a battle group unto themselves, a ship which was a match for several other glorious Heritage class starships combined, which themselves are amongst the most powerful vessels in the galaxy, like the Andromeda Ascendant herself. Vessels such as the Wrath of Achilles would distinguish themselves during the war after the disappearance of Andromeda, but would still survive despite being defeated for 300 years and resist Nietzschean attempts to control them for 3 centuries. Testimony to how well built these things were. They were defiant to the last, amongst the most powerful starships ever produced, not just by the Commonwealth. They were armed with a multitude of weapons. To begin with, there were dozens of different types of missiles and point defense systems, large numbers of fighters, particle cannons, and a huge number of troops and other support craft aboard these vessels. Not to mention each ship was controlled by an advanced AI that, even if the entire crew was wiped out, this thing could keep going. An amazing ship with an amazing design. Very interesting, kind of like a huge, nasty looking squid descending on you in space with its beak open, ready to crunch you to pieces. Beast of a starship. In my number 4 spot is one of my favourite ships in the Babylon 5 universe, a vessel I felt was very underutilised, and actually when I sometimes watch it I do think they could have put a bit more effort into the design, but I still think it's a very interesting starship, and it's the Omega class destroyer Shadow variant, a vessel built by the treacherous forces basically of President Clark and his regime, who collaborated with the Shadows, adapted Shadow technology, perhaps even given some to help build these goddamn things. They were amongst the most powerful vessels at the time ever built by humans. They were the elite, crewed by the equivalent of his SS, his most elite and most loyal soldiers of the regime. The soldiers who would not defect, not surrender. They'd fight to the last man. These ships were able to destroy White Stars, which were amongst the most powerful vessels built by anyone. Ships that were built with the hybridization of Vorlon and Minbari technology, two of the most powerful and advanced races. And these things, built by one of the younger races, were able to take them on. Although they didn't win, they took out several of them. They went down fighting. They were equipped with powerful particle beam cannons, regenerative biomechanical armor, and some advanced point defense systems, not to mention filled with fighters. And as I said, a fanatical crew that simply would not surrender. These ships may or may not have also had potentially other Shadow technology, such as the ability to integrate a telepath into their control networks, or generally a sentient being, that would help control ship systems and allow the vessel to operate independently if necessary, giving it a will. And based on certain technologies that the Earth Alliance was using during the days of the Shadow War, it is entirely plausible that such technologies and such gruesome concepts were implemented by that regime. Anyway, although these vessels only really featured in one episode, they would have a legacy in the spin-off series Crusade, which I'll touch on in a future video. Now for number 3, we've got the Hatak, the Goa'uld mothership from the Stargate franchise, the Pyramid ships, or variant thereof, similar to the vessel originally seen in the movie, commanded by Ra himself. The Hatak was the staple backbone of the Goa'uld navy. This vessel was built just as much to intimidate as it was to destroy stuff. As a result, it could have been functionally better designed. But it was very heavily armed with powerful ion cannons, strong shields, and was damn fast. It had an advanced hyperdrive, it had ring transporters, was capable of carrying a Stargate if needed. It carried large numbers of embarked soldiers who were highly trained, battle-hardened, as well as large numbers of death gliders for ground assault and space combat missions, as well as capable of, if necessary, deploying both Peltax and Alkesh. The Peltax, although not normally armed, made a light cargo ship and scout vessel, and the Alkesh was a long-range, hyperspace-capable scout craft/bomber. Those were quite impressive vessels, actually. All things combined, the Hatak was an impressive starship, and a single one of these things could have laid waste to Earth if it were not for the Asgard, making Earth part of the Protected Planets Treaty and defending us against them. But literally, a single one of these vessels would have been able to destroy every military on Earth, and there would have been nothing we could have done to stop it. They could have just bombarded Earth from orbit for as long as they liked, until we surrendered or until they'd had finished having fun killing us. Then they could have deployed gliders and troops, very easily securing the planet. These ships were formidable, which is why so many of them were utilised by other powers after the fall of the Goa'uld Empire, including the Jafar and Lucian Alliance, because they were so versatile, so effective. They were a very adaptable design, and many variants of them were used by different system lords and other factions across the Goa'uld Empire and beyond. Beautiful ship as well in design. At our number 2 spot, we've got the USS Enterprise E. Now, I was tempted to just use the Enterprise generally, but I thought I was going to settle on the E, and I really was flipping a coin as whether it was going to be the D or the E, after I'd excluded the earlier ones, just because I grew up on the Next Generation. I decided on the E because the vessel just kicks ass. It's bloody awesome. It's the largest in terms of length that of any enterprise in the history of the Federation to date of its construction. It was also one of the most heavily armed and most powerful ships in the Quadrant, especially after its upgrade. The Sovereign class received an upgrade later, a few years after its construction, which included additional torpedo launchers and as well as group multiple torpedo launchers. So basically a single torpedo could fire a cluster of torpedoes rather than just one at once. This was the same as what was on the Enterprise D. That main torpedo it had on the neck could fire 5 torpedoes simultaneously. And although the torpedo launchers in the Enterprise E couldn't do that, it made up for it by just having so many. It also had something like a dozen, or near enough a dozen, Type 11 phaser strips, and those are amongst the most powerful phasers Starfleet could produce. Not to mention the average phaser strip could actually fire more than one beam at once per strip, if necessary, although it did diminish the power somewhat. It had incredibly powerful shields, very resistant hull armor. It was one of the fastest ships around, and the Sovereign class in general was one of the most powerful ships in Starfleet, and of course being the flagship, the Enterprise always got the best of the best. Starfleet was always going to make sure it was tip-top. It had the most torpedoes, it had the most battle-hardened crew, had the best captain, Kevin Picard, fight me. Cisco, actually. But anyway, Picard. The Enterprise E was a brilliant ship, beautiful vessel, and that beauty shot in First Contact when it's first sort of turning into camera. Oh, awesome. Beautiful ship. And at my number 1 spot, a fairly rare one on my list, got the Imperial 1 class Star Destroyer. Now, for all the Star Wars fans out there, I am a big Star Wars fan myself. I do love all Star Destroyers. I mean, fan design, canon designs. I even like the Zeiston class, even though I think it was a bit lazy. I like it. But that's probably because I do actually like the standard Imperial class Star Destroyer. In particular, I like the Imperial 1. The Imperial 2 always bugged me because they removed all of the point defense systems. Supposedly the main gun turrets were capable of targeting fighters because they were specially designed for higher firing rate, so they could theoretically hit small fast moving targets, but the Empire didn't generally consider fighters to be a threat to these things, even though time and time again the rebellion showed that they could be under the right circumstances. You had to a lot of the time you had to swarm attack it, you had to have good pilots, and you still had to deal with the ties, but generally a fighter could become a threat to a Star Destroyer despite its size. The problem was the Star Destroyer couldn't shoot it down, but the Imperial 1 actually had point defense systems. It didn't have good ones, but it had them. They removed them all for the Imperial 2 class, or pretty much all of them, supposedly, as I say, adapting the main guns so they could actually shoot smaller craft. But that never worked very well, and TIE fighters were abysmal. Thrawn was attempting to develop better designs, and a few superior TIE fighters came out towards the end of the Empire, but let's face it, the standard TIE fighter was crap. It was a death trap, and it's actually on my list quite high up in my worst starfighters you'd ever want to be in. It looks cool, sounds cool, sound in space being an interesting idea, but it's still an amazing ship. The Imperial 1 class, it's a behemoth of a starship under anyone's categorization of a vessel. A single one of these vessels could secure several star systems. That's how good they were. Not just through fear. I know the Imperial Doctrine, the Tarkin Doctrine, was to rule through fear, but these things could dish it out too. I mean, they could take on any other capital ship, pretty much from any other navy, and they were going to win. They could take on other, even though their fighters were dog shit, they could take on other massed fighters in addition to it, so they could take on fighter carriers, things like that. These vessels were one-on-one very, very powerful, and the Empire did a good job designing them. And in truth, as part of a more complex navy from what you see on the screen generally in Star Wars, the Star Destroyer made sense. It was designed to be part of a flotilla, but the Empire was always overextended. They should have, in my opinion, kept the Imperial 1 class in service because it had the ability to defend itself against small snub fighters, whereas the idea of the Imperial 2 was that it was designed to take out the capital ships that were carrying the fighters, or the space stations deploying them, or the ground bases, and leave the other fighters and smaller ships to its support craft and corvettes and other such vessels that were never really produced in sufficient numbers by the Empire to really work as a battle group. Think of them as being a bit like a carrier battle group with 1 or 2 Star Destroyers at the centre of it who had all the heavy guns, and the smaller vessels there to work as screens and deal with smaller problems, which would be more perhaps of a nuisance to the Star Destroyer and a hindrance to it taking out its main target rather than actually necessarily able to stop it. as most fighters weren't going to last long in a fight with a Star Destroyer. Despite the fact that its weapons couldn't hit it or target it very quickly, they would probably hit it eventually. And you wouldn't be able to do enough damage to this thing to take it out. They were an impressive vessel. I know, again, fear and intimidation, the large wedge shape was meant to look aggressive, but when you think about the doctrinal reasons for it, more than intimidation, sometimes scaring your enemies so they don't fight you, it saves lives. It saves your lives, it saves your enemies' lives. It's more efficient. If you can win a battle without actually having to fight, that is strategically genius. The Tarkin doctrine had merit, it just didn't work in practice. But the wedge shape allowed the vessel to funnel most of, if not all of, its weapons primarily forwards, or a good number of them to the sides at any given time. It was only to the rear these things tended to be pretty deficient, those huge exposed engines, and not too many weapons that faced rear. But that said, again, you were supposed to have screening vessels. It wasn't just meant to be there on its own. Either way, the first one of these things that descends onto screen in A New Hope, who can deny how brilliant that shot is? In fact, every shot in those movies is brilliant. Some of the most quotable lines. You can name almost any line from Star Wars and someone will recognize it. You'll know it's Star Wars, and if you don't, you're just a nerf herder. So, yeah. Beautiful vessel. An amazing ship, and one of my favorite vessels in sci-fi. I love those things. And I don't care how many people say, oh, they weren't well designed, the Imperial Doctrine was stupid. I don't give a damn. Beautiful vessel. Lovely ship, and immensely powerful. There was a reason everyone was scared of this thing. You gotta look at it like that. Yeah, small vessels might be able to outmaneuver it or outrun it for a while, but not forever. And if you're in a big ship, you better have basically Mon Calamari shield so you can stand toe-to-toe for this thing for a while you run away, because you ain't gonna outgun it. There ain't no one outgunning one of these things. Forget about it. This thing was one of the best things the Empire produced. Of all the things they sunk money into, they sunk it into these, and they did a good job. Anyway, before I ramble on too much further, that's my top 6 vessels so far. I'm gonna have to do more of these lists. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Comment down below, tell me any other vessels you think should have been on this list, or if any of these you think should have been number 1, or tell me what you think of the Imperial 1 class, and tell me why you think it should have been the Imperial 2, or the Imperator, or any other vessel, the Victory class, anything. And with that said, bye bye.